What is generativity, and how can it unleash growth for your business, service, or product? We get cutting-edge insights from Dr. Mohammad Keyhani.
This is the Economics for Business podcast. We're here to help all businesses become champions for customers and value, improving lives with preferred and innovative products and services. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. Entrepreneurial businesses employ creativity and ingenuity to serve customers in new and better ways in order to grow. They first choose a set of customers and invest in understanding those customers and their dissatisfactions. They then set in motion a development process to design, assemble, and deliver products and services to overcome those dissatisfactions. That's the essence of the continuing process of generating value. Increasingly in the digital age, this process is being enhanced or even superseded. On the input side of the business, firms are foregoing the limitations of choosing and targeting customers, replacing that step with unlimited and unfiltered participation. Everyone is welcome. On the output side of the business, firms are aiming to unleash users to generate innovations and new ideas, and to share them, build on them, and improve them further. That's open innovation. The Austrian underpinnings of this emerging business model lie in the knowledge process theory of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs require knowledge of customer dissatisfactions. They need to know what questions to ask to ascertain these hidden or unarticulated needs. Entrepreneurs need to know the processes of product and service development, including digitization, app design, or hiring the right people, assembling the right resources, and getting the right financing. And when they've developed a product or service, they deploy it in the market they've previously identified, which by definition is knowledge constrained. In summary, entrepreneurs don't know all the questions to ask and problems to solve, only some of them. And they can't assemble, examine, and test all ideas and solutions, only some of them. The new business model breakthroughs are aimed at escaping from knowledge constraints. What if the inputs from users were unconstrained and unfiltered? And what if the potential outputs of innovation could come from unlimited sources? And what if entrepreneurs could accurately match those unfiltered inputs and unconstrained outputs? Answering that what if question today is Professor Mohammad Keyhani, professor in entrepreneurship and strategy at the Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary. Dr. Keyhani is also a great supporter of practicing entrepreneurs by his Entrepreneurs Tools website, which we'll talk about today, and his crowdfunding tools page. Professor Keyhani, welcome to the Economics for Business podcast.
Thank you, Hunter, and to your viewers, thank you for having me here today.
Well, it's delightful for us, and I'm going to start with just an introduction. I'd ask you to introduce yourself, Professor, to our listeners. They can find you on your website, mohammadkeyhani.com. We'll link to that. I found out that you have a deep research interest in entrepreneurship. You teach entrepreneurship, the state of the art, and you teach another course called Technology for Entrepreneurs. So please tell us how you developed your expertise in entrepreneurship and some of your focus areas.
Very well, thank you. So just some background on me. I'm an Iranian Canadian. I came to Canada to do a PhD in strategic management, focusing on entrepreneurship in 2008. The focus of my research during my PhD was to try and build on my previous math background, because I had an undergraduate degree in math, and I was somewhat familiar with modeling and simulation work. So I sort of leveraged that to look at the economic foundations of entrepreneurship. Interestingly, when I looked at what it is that the literature calls the economics of entrepreneurship or economic foundations of entrepreneurship, I was pointed in the direction of Austrian economics as a school of thought. But surprisingly, there was very little modeling in that literature. And I later learned that it was sort of a conscious methodological decision by most Austrian economics to avoid mathematical modeling to the extent possible. Not that they don't do any of it, but it's just done very little in that field. So I sort of attempted somewhat of a heretic move in that I said, okay, I'm going to engage Austrian economics, but I am going to model it mathematically with simulations. And that became my PhD dissertation. And I build on that work when I teach the PhD seminar in our own school, the Haskins School of Business, University of Calgary. We have a PhD program in entrepreneurship. And I teach that course, Entrepreneurship, the State of the Art, as sort of a review of the entrepreneurship literature to our PhD students. And I've divided the course mainly based on various disciplinary perspectives, including economics of entrepreneurship, psychology of entrepreneurship, sociology of entrepreneurship. But of course, my own PhD was very much the economics of entrepreneurship. The other course that you mentioned, I'm teaching technology for entrepreneurs, is more, it's an undergrad course, but it's more representative of the more recent research that I'm doing. I can't really describe it as the economics of entrepreneurship, but that the work that I did on the economics of entrepreneurship is very much informing the work that I'm doing on the various technologies that entrepreneurs are using right now. And it's been an insightful effort to link my previous work to this new line of work that has been interesting me. I'm generally very much a technology enthusiast. I very much follow all the latest developments in software technology, and that's sort of what's got me into this new line of work.
Thanks for that background. Just as an aside on Austrian economics, I'm not an academician, so I'm no expert, but I certainly get the impression that the school is coming around to modeling through complexity theory, that the kind of computational modeling, simulation as you referred to it, I think, that you can do when you come through the lens of complexity theory, opens up some modeling pathways for Austrians that maybe they didn't have before. I know Todd Giles said that Austrian economics is a strand of complexity theory, and people are developing that theme, I think. Does that sound right?
That's certainly what I have argued, and others. There's a famous paper called "Was Hayek an Ace?" Ace meaning agent-based computational economist. And I have a paper more recently in the Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal arguing for why simulation methods are compatible with Austrian economics, and how they incorporate to the various aspects of dynamism, subjectivism, uncertainty that the Austrian school prefers, and that were mainly the reasons for why the Austrian school rejected closed form mathematical models. And I kind of argue that simulation methods open that up, as others have argued. But I base my arguments mostly on what I was able to do in my own simulations. But yes, it's I think that is an opportunity. I'm not seeing that many Austrian papers being published with the simulation methods yet, but I do sense a bit of a shift of thinking in the sense that there's more of an openness to it. And I think if that openness wasn't there, I, for example, wouldn't have been able to publish my simulation papers. But I think the openness is increasingly there to explore how these simulation methods can advance the Austrian theory.
Good. Well, that's the subject for a future conversation, Professor. But today we were going to talk about another area of business modeling that you have opened up and are a leading thinker on, and that's generativity, the generative product or generative service. And that's going to be our theme today. It's got a lot of promising implications for entrepreneurs. So can you start by telling us what generativity is, defining generative with regard to businesses and business models?
For sure. I think one of the most common definitions of generativity comes from Jonathan Zittrain, who's probably the main person who has expanded and put forth this theory of technology generativity. His perspective, of course, was from a legal scholarship perspective. That's his field. But he defines a generative system, or the generativity of a system, as a system's capacity to produce unanticipated change through unfiltered contributions from broad and varied audiences. And this is a very variation of his earlier definition. A couple of years earlier, he had published this definition, which is a technology's overall capacity to produce unprompted change driven by large, varied, and uncoordinated audiences. So that's typically taken as the definition, but there's other ways to approach the understanding of generativity. And one is through the particular characteristics of generative technologies, as Zittrain outlines. In his book, he outlines actually 5 different characteristics, which were sort of, number one, leverage, which means how extensively the technology is able to put its various functions to different uses. So the different uses that the functions of the technology can be put to, he calls leverage. Another one is adaptability, which means how much it can be adapted to different tasks. Another one he mentions is ease of mastery, which is how easily people can understand it and use it. Accessibility, which is how easy it is for people to access it. And sort of transferability as the last one, which means how any changes to the technology can be transferred to someone else and basically allow other people to build on what previous people had done with the technology. And I think Zittrain talks about these as characteristics of a technology, but I think from a business perspective, we very much can view these as characteristics of products. They can be products that are more or less generative compared to competitors or compared to other products. Zittrain doesn't have a very product-oriented view to this, but I think it's just a very, very natural step to think of products as being less or more generative.
Well, maybe we can go to that product level, Professor, and talk about maybe the features and benefits, which is kind of the language we think of products and services. And maybe you have some examples that could illustrate that.
Yeah. So I would say overall, and Zittrain mentions this in his book, the main things that identify generativity are the increase of participation as an input and the increase of innovation as an output. So participation as input, innovation as output. And there's existing literature on how firms and companies can benefit from increased participation, because everyone recognizes that not all valuable knowledge is within the company. And so there's this whole literature on open innovation and methods like crowdsourcing and that sort of thing. It's long been recognized that there's benefits to increasing participation into the business of a company or the design of a product. And there's also recognition that this sort of increased participation can lead to a higher number of innovations, more interesting, innovative ideas. But I think what's new in the generativity theory and generativity lens is that the product itself can have features or mechanisms that increases the participation into its own development, evolution, design, use, and also helps increase the innovations that that participation can engender. So I guess the main contribution of generativity is, how do you build a product that almost automatically does that main function of generativity, to increase participation and increase innovation, rather than, say, a non-generative way to increase participation would be to organize a crowdsourcing competition, for example. You could do that, but that's an organizational tool. It's not a feature of the product. When the product itself has features that increase the participation of various users, various contributors to its evolution, that's what we call generativity.
A quick note: did you know that we provide supplemental materials for each podcast? Listening to and understanding the key takeaways from our expert guests helps you think better about building a more beautiful business. Taking direct action and implementing these strategies is when the real work begins. Take a concrete, immediate step to implementing a better business model today by downloading the show notes and business tool we've created for this episode. Visit Mises.org/E4Bpod. That's MISES.org/E, the number 4, the letter B, POD, and click on today's episode. Now, back to our interview.
So my mind leaps to the obvious, and because I'm not very imaginative, but something like Amazon, where people enter searches. And so the more people you get asking more questions, where can I find this, or can you solve this problem for me? You're getting participation in generating problems, and then more suppliers come on the other side with more solutions. Is that a form of generativity?
I would say that is a form of generativity, but you're jumping a bit ahead here, because I think generativity applies to products and to marketplaces or markets as mechanisms. So I think markets are very much a generative systems, and they can be designed to be more generative or less generative depending on the type of market that you need. For example, I think Uber or even Airbnb are very much narrow scope markets, not very generative. Airbnb a bit more than Uber is generative, but compared to Amazon, both of them are not very generative markets. Amazon is a hugely generative marketplace, and it's mostly benefited from the generativity of its marketplace as a business advantage. But so that's why I'm thinking that it's not necessarily that Amazon had a generative product, although I think to some extent they have tried to make their product more generative. But I think the main reason that Amazon has succeeded was the generativity of its marketplace. And I think markets are generative for different reasons than products are generative. But yeah, so if I wanted to give a good examples of generative marketplaces, I would tell you about some of the tools that I've found while I've been sort of curating a page for technological tools for entrepreneurs.
Let me go backwards, Professor. I'm sorry that I leaped ahead to markets and maybe interrupted your flow on product. So what are some examples of generative product so we can understand that?
Yeah, so generative products is generally a bit hard to categorize, right? It's a bit hard to describe exactly what they do because they can do so many different things. They're more like toolkits rather than products,
Mm-hmm.
or they're more like toolkits or general purpose products rather than narrow scope specific use products. So as I was curating my page for tools for entrepreneurs, it's called Entrepreneur Tools. If you Google it or link to it,
Yeah, we'll link to it.
it's a popular resource for entrepreneurs around the world to find all the latest tools that can help them run their business. So um, one of my major value adds basically in curating that page of entrepreneur tools has been to categorize the various tools that I find. And I've increasingly noticed that there are tools in there that are just very hard to categorize because they're these general purpose tools. So examples that I could give, Zapier.com and other competitors to it like Integromat. Um, these are tools that basically connect various other tools to each other through APIs. So they're kind of like um, the plumbing of the internet now. They're connecting various APIs to each other, and there's so many different things you can do with them. Just because there's so many different possible connections between the tools that link to Zapier or Integromat. Another type of tool that I would call generative is something like Google Sheets or its relational database counterpart, Airtable.com. They have allowed users to do so many things with them. In general, spreadsheets, I think, and databases are very generative products, but they can do a lot, but a regular database like MySQL or MongoDB or things like that is not very accessible to the regular person. And spreadsheets make databases more accessible and easy to master, easy to understand to regular people. And Airtable has basically taken the additional step of making a relational database, not just a spreadsheet, but kind of like a spreadsheet where its rows can be objects that have their own spreadsheets. That's what a relational database is. And so Airtable has opened that up to the regular user. And you could even say that because it's cloud-based, it even increases generativity because there's so many things you can do with software as a service or cloud software that you can't do with client-based or desktop software. So Airtable is another example of generative software. Another category that I would call generative these days are these dynamic document creation and note-taking tools. For example, Coda.io and its main competitor, Notion.so. These two tools are very hard to describe exactly what they do because they do so many things. But they are becoming increasingly popular. People are doing a lot with them. Some people are creating blogs with them. Some people are creating websites with them. Some people are creating project management tools or team collaboration tools with them, group note taking, knowledge base building. There's so many things that you can do with these tools that they're very clearly generative products. And finally, another category that I would say are very generative products on the rise these days are no-code software development tools. Something like Adalo.com for building mobile apps, VoiceFlow.com for building voice-based apps, Bubble.io for building web apps. These no-code software development tools are very much generative because they're opening up the ability to create software to so many regular users, regular people who don't have computer science degrees or haven't built the expertise as like a back end or front end or full stack developer. They're not really developers, but just playing around a few minutes with Bubble, they can become developers. And it's amazing how it's opening up participation into software development, and therefore increasing innovation, because now you have so many people who would otherwise not be building software able to build software and able to innovate using software. So that's why I would definitely put these no-code development tools as a category of generative software.
Well, that's really exciting. That's cutting edge kinds of opportunities for entrepreneurs. And so one of the elements of explanation or the theory behind these things that you put forward, which is also exciting, is that generativity overcomes knowledge constraints that all entrepreneurs face. You can't possibly know all the problems to solve and all the questions to ask. You can't possibly know how to fix every need that a customer has. You can't. We see entrepreneurs as orchestrators, and orchestration is a really hard thing to do when you've got knowledge constraints. So expand on that a little bit. Filling knowledge constraints or softening knowledge constraints for entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm. This sort of knowledge-based foundations of the theory of generative products and markets is something I've already begun to explore in a paper we published in Strategy Science on what we called firm-designed markets. So the idea is that the firm, and this is the main idea behind open innovation theory as well, the firm itself and its employees, no matter how big the firm is, even if you're Google and you have 100,000 of the smartest minds in the world working for you, you still don't have the majority of the good ideas, because you just don't have the majority of the people of the world in your company. Mm-hmm. So if you can find ways to open up the participation that goes into your products beyond the boundaries of your company, you are able to address your own knowledge constraints, including and especially your blind spots, because sometimes you have knowledge constraints. You know that you don't know something. Those are known unknowns, but sometimes you're dealing with unknown unknowns. They are very much your blind spots. You don't even know where to look. You don't even know that you should be looking for an answer, or that if you look for an answer, there might be opportunities there. So I think the main feature of generativity, whether it's the generativity of products or the generativity of markets, the main feature is that it sort of I would say automates, but how should I describe it? It's more like detaching the search process from the searcher. So if the search process for knowledge is always constrained by the searcher, it means that it's constrained by the blind spots of the searcher, mm-hmm. because the searcher only knows to search in certain places. So if you can find mechanism that detaches the search process from the searcher, it unconstrains the search process in a way that potentially allows the search process to get into what otherwise would be blind spots for the searcher. So I think that's the key feature of generativity, whether it is the generativity of products or markets. With products, you have features in the product itself that result in that knowledge search, that gets different users to come and play with the product, learn to do things with the product that the product designer couldn't have even imagined. I don't think the creators of spreadsheets or PCs or or even like Zapier, Airtable, Bubble, all these tools that I mentioned, I don't think they could have fully imagined all the things that their users are building with their products. And so these products have features that allow them to unconstrain or unlink the search process from the knowledge constraints of the searcher. So they don't need to be directed in a lot of ways, because they have the features built in that allow them to elicit participation and create innovations out of that participation without a guided search process.
Yeah.
And so same with generative markets. Generative marketplaces allow the incentives of the market to take control of the search process in a way so that no one person has to define what is the problem area we should be searching for. You just let the demand side of the market define problem areas, and the supply side define solution areas. And sometimes it is a bit switched up. So sometimes the demand side might not even realize that it has a problem or that it needs a product or wants a product until a supply side solution is provided.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is that the marketplace creator, as the owner of the generative product, here being the marketplace, the generative marketplace, doesn't have to know or doesn't even have to define all the problems and solutions. It can benefit from all the problem solution matches that are created in the market, and that's a huge source of profit potentially, and a huge source of competitive advantage when you're able to automatically profit from problem solution matches where neither the definition of problems nor the definition of solutions are constrained by your own internal knowledge as a company. It's like opening a door to a whole new level of potential opportunities and profits that was previously closed because you were constrained by your own knowledge of where to search for problems and solutions.
Yeah, I was very taken in one of the early Zatrain papers that you sent me about, at a very high level, the idea if you attach a personal computer to a network like the internet, there's no telling what solutions that will generate. You couldn't possibly imagine where we are today when somebody first did that, connected a PC to the internet. And that was a very stimulating idea. Obviously, it's a very high level, but it kind of illustrates what you just said, I think.
Well, Zatrain, when he's describing generative products, the two main examples of generative technologies that he talks about in his book is one, the PC, and two, the internet. And so when you talk about connecting the PC to the internet, it's like a doubling of generativity, which is, it's not, I shouldn't call it doubling because it's not a linear addition process. It's a combinatorial or a non-linear
exponential, would that be a word?
Yeah, that's the word. It's an exponential synergy of generativity that happens when you connect multiple sources of generativity to each other. So I actually, the theory that I'm working to build, and this hasn't been published yet, but it's sort of the next logical step based on what I've done so far, and the draft papers that I've been working on. The next logical step for me is, now that I've sort of theorized how products can be generative, and I haven't done most of the work on that. I would say maybe Zatrain and the information systems literature has talked about how products can be generative, although I am doing some work about what that means for entrepreneurship and product management. But so there is that point that products can be generative. Mm-hmm. And then this theory that I'm building around how markets can be generative. I'm talking about firm designed markets, but I'm basically borrowing theory from all the people in the economics literature that have argued that economies are knowledge generating systems. So I'm borrowing theory from them, all the literature on endogenous growth theory, the works of Edmund Phelps on dynamic economies. I'm building on them to theorize how firm design marketplaces can be generative. So the next step, logically, would be similar to what Zittrain has described as this combination of two generative technologies. I would say that those companies that have been able to benefit from generativity in their products in exponentially synergistic combination with generativity in a firm designed marketplace that they operate and they profit from, those companies have the potential for huge success. And I think if you look at, say, the top 10 most valuable companies in the world today, you will be able to identify some mechanism like this, some mechanism involving the combination of a generative marketplace with a generative product. And I think that's it's kind of a generativity-based theory of competitive advantage that mostly explains the outliers of success in today's economy. So it's not meant to generally explain performance heterogeneity or competitive advantage in general for all firms, but it is a tool that can explain why some of the outliers of performance today are outliers.
And could it be more generally applied in the future, do you think, Professor? You talked about mass flourishing and dynamism at the economy level, at the national level, but perhaps it's the future of growth on a broader basis, not just for outliers, which is true today, but more entrepreneurs might be able to harness generativity in the future, do you think?
Well, I think it's very difficult to achieve the combination of generative products and generative marketplaces. In general, everybody all in the entrepreneurship world, in the Silicon Valley tech world, everyone knows that these marketplace businesses are very attractive because you basically, as I said, the problems and the solutions are basically taken care of by the demand side and supply side, and you basically just benefit as the orchestrator of the market or the governor of the market. So these business models are known to be very valuable, very lucrative. Although I would say maybe it's not as recognized that generative markets have the potential to be much more lucrative than non-generative markets. So, for example, Apple and Google being the profits that they make from the Apple Store or the Android Play Store, for example, as marketplaces, or the profits that Amazon makes from its generative marketplace. I don't think that a firm with a non-generative marketplace, say like the Ubers of the world, I don't think they can easily reach that level of profitability. Because in the end, the Ubers of the world are very much allocative marketplaces. Their main goal is to increase the efficiency of resource allocation in the world. And they will profit for as long as there is inefficient allocation in the particular market that they're operating in. But generative markets are not just about resource allocation. So they're not limited by the extent of allocation inefficiency that's out there. They have unbounded potential for growth because every time somebody comes up with an idea or innovation, they benefit from it. So one of my favorite examples is that game that became popular on mobile devices a few years ago I think it was called Flappy Bird.
Angry Birds, are you thinking about?
No.
No, Flappy
After,
Birds?
much later than Angry
Okay,
Bird, there was
sorry.
just I think like one student in I forget where, Vietnam or Thailand, just sat down and wrote a fun mobile app game to play, and the game went viral and got so many users to play and purchase it, and it was making a lot of money. And Google, I think it was on the Android market, Google was benefiting, or if it was on iOS as well, then Apple was benefiting as well, without having to even think about, without having to even be in the game business. They were benefiting from this idea for an innovative game that someone across the world had developed in their spare time.
Yeah. Would TikTok be an example of generativity? You've got immense number of users creating all kinds of different ways to generate videos and animations and things on TikTok. Is that an example?
Yeah, I guess to some extent. I wouldn't call TikTok a very generative tool, but on a spectrum of generativity, it is relatively generative. So the benchmark to test how much of a product is generative or not is to see how much it's able to be put to different uses that maybe it was not even intended to be in the first place. So, for example, when Facebook creates a platform just for people to connect to their friends, and then it realizes that users are now using it to organize events or buy and sell used goods. It sort of it shows that the platform had generativity. The users were able to adapt it to new uses. And then Facebook is often sort of caught up with these new uses by building specific functionality to address the ways that people are now using it. So yeah, sort of benchmark to see to what extent a product is generative is to see if it's allowing users to do things with it that nobody had expected, or that the initial product wasn't really made to do that. So I guess TikTok is an example of a company or a product that is to some extent generative.
User-generated innovation.
Yeah. User-generated innovation that so one level of generativity is the extent to which it allows users to innovate. But sometimes those innovations are cumulative. They change the product, or they do something with the product that allows others to improve their own innovation as well. So I think that cumulativity is what Zittrain was trying to get at with his transferability characteristic. So if for example, someone does something cool with a spreadsheet tool that they then put the template out there for other people to use as well, that's an example of how these user innovations can be cumulative. And if a market can incentivize those sorts of transferability, then that's again another level of generativity. So, for example, Airtable or Bubble, they allow users to create templates with their product and then sell those templates or components in a generative marketplace that arises around a product that it's itself generative. So that's a very powerful mechanism. And I've seen various companies that, for example, have generative products, but really don't try or fail to create generative markets around them. So examples could include, some 3D printers, for example, are very generative products. They can do many different things, and people build things with them that are very innovative, that is not necessarily imagined by the creator of 3D printers. But the extent to which you have marketplaces that incentivize people to buy and sell innovations by other users of 3D printers differs, I think, across the industry. I think there's some websites that allow buy and sell, some are completely open source. There's variations. And then there's also the issue of appropriation. That as a company, how much are you appropriating, or are you benefiting from the innovations that come out of the generativity of your products or your markets? So an example of a generative product that also has a generative market around it, but is maybe not appropriated fully by any one company, is the WordPress content management system. It's a huge product. It's I think Wikipedia, according to Wikipedia, 60% of all the websites on the internet that use a content management system are built on WordPress. That's a huge amount.
Right.
But WordPress is completely open source, not really owned by any one particular for-profit company. And there has been a generative marketplace around WordPress. So there's so many other companies now building themes and selling themes for WordPress, components, widgets, add-ons for WordPress, service companies helping you customize and install WordPress. There's so much of a market around it, but it's not the kind of market that's owned or appropriated by any one particular company. So that generativity is benefiting society in a way, but there's no one company, like the way that Google benefits from the Android market or Apple benefits from the iOS App Store. There's no equivalent of that for WordPress.
Well, Professor, we're running up against our time here, and you've given us an awful lot to think about. So thank you for that. You mentioned a paper that you're working on that will tell us a little bit more about managing generative products. When do you expect to publish, or is there a...
Yeah, this paper, I'm hoping to publish that one as maybe a book chapter. I have another one that I'm working on, theorizing the generativity of markets. I'm calling it a theory of market generativity. And then I want to take the next logical step of hopefully publishing a paper that outlines the generativity theory of competitive advantage. So that generativity theory of competitive advantage would describe how certain companies that have been able to benefit from generative markets and generative products have become outliers and the extent to which they've benefited. Some of the ideas in that paper around generative products and what they mean for entrepreneurship and product management include this. First of all, some of the advantages and disadvantages of generative products. Not all products should be generative or need to be generative. So, for example, when you're trying to match the market of drivers and people who want to go from place A to place B, you don't necessarily want generativity. You don't want a lot of innovations to happen in this market because the product is very much well-defined, narrow scope, and people need it. So you want to address the need for that product. You want to minimize the noise. So you actually don't want it to be too generative, because generative markets are noisy. They're full of innovations, and they're messy.
Right.
And so sometimes you don't want the market to be messy. Yeah. Another example of a market you don't want to be messy is the market for organ donations, for example. The matching of organ donors to organ recipients, which is a market design problem, and Alvin Ross's work on that and similar types of matching markets has won the Nobel Prize. Those are often types of markets that you don't want to be messy and noisy. You want them to be very efficient resource allocation mechanisms. But sometimes you do want your product or your market to be generative, and there's ways to design them to be more generative. But so if you are going that route and you want a generative product, there's tricks to it, because for example, you need to be more patient. And if you have venture capital backing, you need to have the type of backers, investors that are more patient with their capital, because generative products often are not narrowly defined or well defined, and they sort of get their definitions. They become co-created and co-defined by all the participants and all the users that use them, and decide what they're good for and come up with ideas for what they're good for. So, for example, there's this example of this company called Spark Fun that creates products around very generative platforms like the Raspberry Pi or the Arduino board. These are very generative hardware products that basically allow people to build their own homemade computers. So SparkFun is a company that makes products around these platforms. And I read in a paper that they, at some point when they realized how people are using their products for things that they didn't think that they would be used for, they decided intentionally as a company to no longer label their products as having certain uses, because what they would label their products as the uses would be limited by their own knowledge. Whereas when these products go out and get exposed to the innovations of a variety of users outside their company, they realize that it has uses that they never even thought of. So that becomes tricky for entrepreneurship, because a lot of the sort of methodologies like the lean startup or various the value proposition canvas or the business model canvas, the various tools that we use in the entrepreneurship world, a lot of them don't assume generativity by default. They assume that the company can define exactly what problem it's trying to solve with the product from the get-go. They assume that the company knows what the uses are for the product from the get-go. And when you don't know those things and you're creating them with your users, things are different. So I think, for example, this whole emphasis on customer feedback in the lean startup approach, in the case of generative products, you would need to go from customer feedback to customer play. You need to allow customers to play around with the product and discover new uses, rather than just show them a demo and get their feedback, because that traditional or the commonplace way to do it right now, to show someone a demo and get their feedback, is not it doesn't properly address the generativity mechanism. Generativity really needs the user and many users to play with a product, to learn what it can do, rather than just show someone a demo. So I can just imagine the Coda.io or Notion.so, the way that they've been growing. It takes a long time for all the different users that have played with these products to realize what they can do with it. But these companies have to have the patience to let the users play, let them learn, and then capture the learning and convey it to other users. It takes a long time. It's a different process. But you just have to realize that if you're working on a product that is generative, some things about how you manage the entrepreneurship process might be different.
Yeah. It sounds a lot like emergence, Professor. In complex systems, you can't predict what outcomes are going to emerge. You just got to sit back and watch the emergence. And as you say, that might take time.
Exactly. That's a very good term for it, emergence.
Good. Well, I'm going to have to wrap it up for time reasons, Professor, but thank you so much for this exposition of generativity. We'll ask you to come back perhaps sometime in the future and tell us more about the specifics of managing generative products, because you gave us some guidance there at the end of our time about what to do and what not to do if you're managing those. And we're hoping for our Economics for Business platform to be generative in some ways, and we'd love to discuss that with you. But thank you so much for today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'd be happy to come back sometime in the future. This is a relatively new area of work for me. I haven't published anything, other than a little bit on the strategy science paper, but most of my thinking on generativity theory hasn't been published yet. So once I sort of polish those and go through the peer review process and manage to publish them, I'll probably have more to say by then, and I'd be happy to rejoin the conversation here.
Good. We look forward to it. Thank you very much, Professor Keyhani.
Economics for Business is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. And for more from Hunter Hastings, visit hunterhastings.com.